Hello, Julia. Hello, everyone.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Yeah, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How about you?
Yeah, good. And but early morning here.
So you have an early start, I have a late evening.
Yeah, what time in New Zealand now?
It's 9:45 in the evening.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Not too bad.
Oh, could be worse, I guess, but it's fine.
Yeah, I'm like 4:40 a.m. in the morning.
Ooh, I guess getting up
Yeah.
is harder than
Yeah, and then we had a
something like this.
hackathon at midnight my time, and yeah, but it's really good. People are really participating well, and yeah, we receive really good attendance as well.
Wow. Fantastic. That makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it?
Yeah, I will make you the host. Let me see, and that will be easier for you to share the
Yes,
slide.
then I can share more easily. And actually,
Yeah.
and I can also take a recording for myself too.
Yeah, so I just made you the co-host.
Thank you.
And yeah, I will also make our volunteer the co-host. Sabiha, okay. Hi, Sabiha.
Hello.
Yeah, I will make you the co-host as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So it will be much more convenient now.
Excellent. So how many participants have there been for the whole symposium so far?
It went well, yeah. And yeah, sorry. So this is a question to me, right? Yes.
To you or to the volunteers?
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah,
I think I really enjoy it. I really like that, you know, we bring both the people from the academic as well as the industry. So particularly for today, we have like hotel general managers, and we also have destination managers, and we have STR, the vice president, and they all come here to share with the researchers in our field. And yesterday we had the editors series. And I just observed that the 3 top journals in hospitality and tourism, they all happen to be female editors at this moment. And then I really enjoyed that session. So very interesting perspective as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, I actually heard part of it only, but yeah, it was great. But I agree, there's increasingly in these roles. So yay.
Yep. Yes. So maybe I will have a brief introduction of you, Julie, and I will leave the stage to you, the rest of the time to you, and you decide how you're going to run the workshop and then whether you want to, yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, just let me know what works for you. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good day, everyone. Whether it be a morning or night or noontime or afternoon. So thank you for attending today's session. And today we are welcoming Dr. Julia Appert, and she is going to have a workshop regarding publishing qualitative research. Julia is an expert in designing quality research, and she has a lot of publications in top-tier journals in our field. So she is a senior lecturer at this moment at the Department of Tourism at the University of Otago. And she also has her academic background in multiple disciplines, so including geography, landscape ecology, political studies, and tourism. So Julia published a lot of papers, top quality papers in leading journals in the field, such as Journal of Tourism, Journal of Sustainable Tourism, Tourism Management Perspective, Tourism Management, and Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research. She is also a journal editor, as well as serving in many journals editorial board as well. She also published books, and one of her recent published books is called Visitor Management in Tourism Destinations and Managing Visitor Experiences in Nature-Based Tourism. Publishing qualitative research is always challenging. And I believe from Julia's perspective, you will find a lot of inspirational thoughts, and then that would be very beneficial for us to design and publishing quality research using qualitative research method. So I believe the rest of the time to Julia, and the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I believe I have started screen sharing. Can you confirm that that is actually the case? Okay, let's see. Here we go. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. Qualitative research is one of the things I enjoy talking about a lot. So I hope we are going to have a nice 45 minutes or so, followed by questions tonight. So just to briefly introduce the presentation for today as well. I don't think I need to go into any more biographical details because Emily has covered that very thoroughly. I just wanted to briefly talk about the type of research that I'm doing so that you have a better context for any of the examples that I'm going to use throughout the workshop tonight. So these are just a few arbitrary recent papers, and you see that they are mostly in the areas of tourism and destination management, with a strong focus on sustainable destinations or destinations that are in the transition, I suppose, towards becoming sustainable destinations. There's interest in visitor management and nature-based tourism as well. So a lot of the examples that I'm going to use come from these recently published papers. Before we continue with the content though, I think we really need to consider why we are here and also why you are here. I mean, we know that qualitative research has in fact long been valued in the field of tourism and in hospitality as well. And we get lots of books that tell us how to do qualitative research. So these are sometimes very hands-on instructions. At other times, we look at in great detail into the philosophical underpinnings of qualitative research. And yet, qualitative research is, as we know in some journals, still sort of the poor cousin, isn't it? It's got a reputation for being harder to publish. It's got a reputation for being less rigorous, and we're going to talk about what that means tonight. And this can be a result of many things, right? It can be a result of editor or reviewer preferences. And those of us who have tried to publish qualitative research in the past will probably be familiar with that sensation of, oh, that reviewer was probably someone from the quantitative side of things, right? Where you feel that the research hasn't really been quite well understood. Other challenges may be in journals' evaluation criteria, even in the word length that is sometimes permitted in journals, and of course issues of validity, reliability, rigor, and so on. And again, this is something that we're going to have to discuss today. Could you maybe take the time, just maybe 20 seconds or so, to let me know what brought you to this workshop today? Why is this relevant to you? Are you currently writing up qualitative research? Have you come across any specific challenges? So I would be grateful if we could just take a very short period of time to give me an idea of why you're here. And I'll keep scanning the screen as you write. So far I'm getting the impression that we're all in the same boat, writing up qualitative work in the form of papers, in the form of a thesis. And yes, we have come across similar challenges. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. So what we then all might be sometimes struggling with is the fact that qualitative research can potentially sometimes be difficult to convey as evidence, right? And that's not because we don't believe that it's evidence. It's because sometimes editors or reviewers may have clouded perceptions of what it is that we're actually doing. So if we think about quantitative research, people look at the numbers and they think, oh, well, this is, this is objective. There's sort of a black or white type of perception. There are no gray areas in terms of what constitutes evidence and what doesn't. Whereas the selection of quotes from interviews, for example, is sometimes perceived as something that is very individual and subjective. Whereas in fact, it's potentially an immediate sharing of what our respondents have actually told us, but it's perceived as less worthy because it may have been only a small group of participants, and it may only have been perceived as important by us. So therefore, how is it evidence, right? And we could spend a long time feeling sorry for ourselves, or we could take a more active approach and say, look, this probably means that we as authors of qualitative empirical works need to assume the responsibility to explain to our readers why this is perfectly wonderful evidence and why they should not only publish it, but also read it and learn from it. So instead of saying, ooh, this is so terrible, I think we need to take a hands-on approach now and think about how we can deal with this and how we can make our research, qualitative research, more accepted. And I think we need to also tidy up with a few terms around research and how it's being described. And a lot of the qualitative papers that we see sometimes almost try to emulate quantitative work, right? They talk about validity, they talk about reliability. And rigor, so pretty much the holy trinity of the quantitative worldview, right? And a lot of qualitative work tries to sort of emulate that and buy into it. I think what we need to appreciate is that this is associated with a specific paradigm, with a specific ontology. These terms are associated with a logical positivist worldview. So if we look at validity in that context, we can, for example, use Pollitt and Hangler's quote where they say that validity is the degree to which an instrument measures what it is intended to measure. And even qualitative research demigods, Guber and Lincoln, say, oh, well, this is an important concept, but we need to draw it into the qualitative realm. And they said, oh, look, we can reframe it as credibility. And they say, look, if we use the term credibility, we can move beyond this logical positivist paradigm, and we can account for the constructed realities of constructivism. It's difficult, isn't it? On the one hand, we are supposed to talk about the validity of our research, but on the other hand, we impose these assumptions on work that is in fact quite different. And I think what helps us to sort of step away from these things is the following. We have a subjective thing in qualitative research in terms of, for example, thinking about the rapport between interviewer and interviewee as something that adds a degree and a level of subjectivity to the research, right? But what about the fact that even in quantitative research, even if we work within this logical positivist paradigm, there are still many levels of subjective decisions that go into the research. Even a quantitative researcher will put together a research design based on their ability, opinion, worldview, context. Even a researcher working in the logical positivist paradigm will have to make decisions about not only what questions to ask, but also how to ask them, what the wording is going to be like, when to ask them, how much time to give people to respond, all of these things that add levels of subjectivity and arbitrariness to a research. So, you know, it's not that different after all. I'm not wanting to say that one research approach is better than another. I just wanted to appreciate that regardless of whether we work quantitatively or qualitatively, we are dealing with levels of subjectivity here. And in the same way, we can also consider the requirement of reliability as the consistency or constancy of a measuring instrument. Also here, Gruber and Lincoln have tried to draw this idea of replicability of a study into the qualitative realm. And just as much as we did with validity, we can also take a more relative view of this term as well. It's true that reliability and replicability is only possible to a very limited extent with qualitative studies, isn't it? The same can be said for many quantitative studies as well. And I think we need to acknowledge that replicating any type of study at all is a very difficult thing to do. Again, I'm not saying that any research is better or worse than another approach, but we need to be very clear that we are dealing with very fluid constructs and research designs that do depend on how people see the research problem in question and how they want to approach it. The issue of rigor, we are going to tackle separately later. So what I'm wanting to say is that our challenge really is, how do we convey the value of our research? And in our case today, of qualitative research. Any research that gets published needs obviously to be meaningful, it needs to be well conducted, and that it has a valid research design. But it also needs to be well reported, it needs to be well justified. And our job today is to think about how can we justify and explain the value of our research in the form of a paper. Now, obviously, since a lot of the time we are dealing with criticism of methodology and method with qualitative research, we need to look at the research design itself, but we also need to look at how we actually write it up. And I would be grateful if we could do another round of chat responses, considering whether the challenges in writing up qualitative research that you have listed earlier, whether these result more from the research design itself and putting that together and writing that up, or whether you think the challenges are more the write-up of the research as a whole. So is it the methodology write-up that makes it hard to convey the value of qualitative research? Or is it the whole paper where we tell a coherent story of our research? So let's just compare notes, and if we could all add just a short comment on this to the chat, that would be fantastic. Validity of the method. Thank you very much, Svea. Telling a story. Yes, that's actually going to be one of my headings later. Thank you very much, Carla. Okay, Cindy focuses on the methodology section rather than the overall story of the paper. All right, thank you very much for your comments. So just a small number of comments here shows us that it can be one or the other or both. So let's see how much we can actually get done in the remainder of our conversation. The fact that obviously the method is one of the crucial points I wanted to illustrate with this paper here, which came out earlier this year. And that's a paper that has roughly 9,000 words, but just to illustrate, of those 9,000 words, 1,400 is method section. So obviously, clearly in an empirical qualitative paper, we probably write up a higher proportion of the paper in the form of the method section compared to a quantitative paper, which of course gives us some of the challenges related to the word count sometimes. So let's start with thinking about the research design itself. And this is where we now need to revisit and talk about the notion of rigor in a qualitative study. Now, obviously, this isn't a methodology workshop, so we can't go into too much detail, but obviously we need to consider it in sufficient depth to actually be in a position to write it up properly. So we sort of put into perspectives the idea of validity and reliability, and yet we need to communicate that the research that we have done is solid, which in the context of qualitative work typically means that we want what is in the literature referred to as a thick description, and we want a sufficient number of points of engagement with our respondents to have achieved some sort of data saturation. So this is really qualitative research 101, isn't it? We all did this in our PhD empirical data collection workshop. So for many of us, this will be at least a year or two in the past, maybe longer. What we need to think about in terms of rigor is the idea of alignment. So we may have a fantastic number of rich, dense interviews with lots of information. These are worth nothing if they don't align with our research questions, with our method, and importantly, with what we are going to do with our empirical representations. And for those of us who are regularly reviewing papers, we sometimes see that very strongly, don't we? Where someone has fantastic data and then after the fact of data collection, they think about, oh, what theory am I going to use and how am I going to write it up? This really shows in a paper. So where there's no alignment, where there's no coherence between the theory and the empirical work, we are usually getting in trouble with reviewers, with PhD supervisors, with everyone who's looking at our work. So when we write up our method section, and especially the limitations part thereof, we might want to talk about how our study is coherent and how we have explicitly aligned our theory with our empirical work. So as a marker of a rigorous study, coherence in qualitative research is a very valuable idea. If we want to talk about alignment even more broadly from the start of the study with the initial research idea, including the end of the practical implications and so on, we may also be talking about credibility, not in the sense of the study being reliable in the quantitative sense, but in the sense that a reader will think, yes, this is a study that has gone through the whole research process without getting sidetracked, without using unnecessary theory, without using unnecessary literature. We will have done all these things. We will have looked into literature that got us sidetracked. We all do that. We may have considered methods that we ultimately didn't use. We will have done all of these extra things, but our alignment needs to be visible in the final paper. We need to get rid of our various sidetrack ideas and present this coherent story in order to convey a sense of credibility to our readers. In terms of the more tangible things that we find a lot in advice, I suppose, about qualitative research, we will find specific advice like, for example, using respondent validation, writing up the transcript or having them done by someone else, and then running those transcripts past our respondents again to achieve a level of validation in that sense. Although a lot of the, for example, PhD workshops present this as a gold standard of validating qualitative research, I wanted to use this opportunity to say that actually this is also increasingly being criticized as not as meaningful as initially it was made out to be. On the one hand, it omits a lot of context. It's something that we can't really trust our respondents to do at all times, because they may have lost interest in the meantime, or they may have changed their mind and might not want to acknowledge what they have said in the past. So while respondent validation as an ethical measure to give participants a chance to revise their answers, as an ethical measure, I would argue this is still a useful thing to do if that's what you want to do. But as a validation of the empirical work in qualitative research, it's a bit so-so. And I'm just looking at the chat because the number of comments just went up. Sorry, just scanning through the comments. There are two questions in there. Let's definitely revisit those. That's excellent points. Thank you. So what is recommended in the literature instead at the moment is things like checks by a third party, for example, or more involved qualitative techniques, for example, techniques from ethnography like prolonged involvement, persistent observation, and so on, which are obviously a lot more time consuming on the part of the researcher as well. The other thing that is often mentioned, and I don't want to go into that in too much detail, is the idea of triangulation, which is usually associated with mixed methods or multi-methods. But especially with qualitative research, I find it very useful to think about triangulation across different researchers or investigators, and that's something that we have done quite a bit in the past, where the researchers haven't worked together as closely as one might expect, because we all wanted to do our data analysis separately in order to really triangulate the research results. This has been in the past often described as external auditing, but no matter what you call it, it's actually something that we find really useful in order to consider and reconsider our research results. And in the past, this has been the traditional method of triangulation with multi-methods or mixed methods has been criticized by Bloor in this case for having a multitude of methods without knowing with absolute certainty which method in the end brought the most applicable or the most valuable results. And this is part of why in recent projects we have moved away from this, from mixed methods, with a view of deciding on one or two methods and having multiple researchers doing the data analysis separately. So moving on from the research design considerations to what some of you have mentioned as an important topic for today potentially, and that's the actual write-up of the qualitative research. And for those of us who do a lot of reviewing or some reviewing, this is where we tend to see one huge difference between qualitative and quantitative papers. So with quantitative papers, there almost seems to be an assumption that the paradigm and the context is self-evident, and obviously in many ways it is. But with qualitative research, we cannot make that assumption. So everyone who is well versed in one or more of the qualitative research traditions will want to see a lot more than just saying, oh, by the way, this is an interpretive work, moving on. So obviously we have a lot more options in qualitative research, how we ground our work. And it's very important to convey these to our editors, reviewers, and readers as well. So within the confines of this short workshop, obviously we can't look into each of them separately. This is something to do with your colleagues or supervisors or whatever the situation might be. But the important point is that this is something that is what sets qualitative empirical papers apart. In the same way, we need to make decisions what we can and can't talk about in a paper. So we may have all these complex ideas about the philosophical foundations of our work, where it fits in terms of ontology, axiology, epistemology, and so on. But obviously, we only have a certain number of words that we can use. So thinking about what part of the iceberg to reveal, or which how many paragraphs or sentences to write about this, all of this will depend on the word count that the journal allows us, but also on how important this actually is for our empirical work that we are writing up. And as a general rule, I would usually say that if it's a well-known qualitative method, like for example, focus groups, we can probably dispense with much of the bottom of the iceberg. But if we are being a bit more, I suppose, creative, or in many cases, if we are writing up PhD research that often has very complex methodologies, we might find it difficult to have a comparatively short method section that we can really fit into a journal article. And this is why for the PhD students among you, hopefully your supervisors will explain which parts of the whole iceberg need to go into the method section, because this is something that can really make or break a paper as well. The following is something that is true for all papers, not only for qualitative papers, obviously. So relevance, the question of why should anyone care about the work? And the reason I'm including it anyway is that this is different from journal to journal. And we all know that there are certain journals who are more likely to publish qualitative research compared to others who may focus more on quantitative research. And the relevance, whether your work is going to be relevant to a journal, can be ascertained, at least to an extent, from the little aims and scope section that each journal has on their website. I feel like I'm stating something self-evident right now, but I know that a lot of people don't really look at those. But just to use this one as an example, so here's the Jhdm aims and scope section from that website. It doesn't specify a preference for qualitative or quant work, which is great because we know Jhdm publishes both. We also know that some other journals may state a preference. They may not state it in those very obvious terms. They might not say, oh, we tend to publish con work, but it may be there in sort of, coded form. And then we know that we might have to consider selecting another journal. Related to this, in many cases, we see authors selecting a journal after they have written the paper. Don't do that either. That makes your life unnecessarily hard. Speaking as an editor, sometimes people will actually write and say, look, here's what we have done. Just as an email with 3 or 4 sentences. This is our research. Will it potentially be a good fit? Or are we setting us up for a desk reject? And that's not a bad strategy. Don't send the editor your full draft or even your structure, but a short email asking, is this within the scope of what you're publishing? Here's our method in 2 sentences. That can actually be quite helpful. Because the thing is, many papers do not necessarily get rejected by high impact journals because of issues of quality. A lot of the time, people know that where their paper sits in terms of where they can submit it. A lot of the time it's about fit, and fit relates to relevance, obviously. So what can you do to connect your research with your audience, considering that editors do act sort of as filters in some case? You can have a look at other issues of the journal. Do they publish qualitative work like the stuff that you have written? What do you think their reader groups are? What sort of disciplines or fields can you reach for your research if you submit to that particular journal? And as an example from my own work, I don't usually publish in open access, but for a paper that looks at product development, I actually thought, well, this is something that could be relevant to industry. Industry obviously doesn't have Elsevier or whatever subscription, so therefore work that may be relevant to practitioners, I would much rather publish in open access journals like sustainability. So just sort of as an example of the thought process that might have gone in it. And yes, I did have a look at the journal first to see whether they would be publishing qualitative empirical work at all, and if so, what the chances of that might be. So considering that our messages may be worth more to some audiences than to others, and obviously we want to focus on the audience for qualitative research. Beyond relevance, obviously, we put a lot of work into our research. We want to add meaning, and we want to communicate what kind of meaning we can actually add. And again, this is self-evident, but a lot of people don't realize that different journals may be looking for different meaning as well. We know there are journals that will focus on theoretical contributions only. And that's perfectly fine, but we need to know which journals those are, because if our qualitative research tries to add meaning in a different way, then it's relatively useless for us. Other journals may be focusing on significance for business or social value or whatever else. So the question is, where can we add meaning? And if we go back to our example of Jhdm, we know that in many cases, industry relevance is encouraged, which is great. So again, how do we communicate the relevance of our paper? And again, something that many academics don't really tend to do, but there is nothing wrong in putting findings into your title so that a desk reject becomes a lot less likely if the editor-in-chief gives things a quick scan only to see if the journal fits within to the aims, if the paper, fits within the scope and aims of the paper at all. And this is something that we did with a paper earlier this year, where we said, here's what we've done, here's what we found, and we put it in the title. And the reason that journals like this is that obviously it increases readership and therefore indirectly citations as well. For some reason, qualitative papers often don't do this. And I think the reason is that authors might feel that their contribution is a bit more, I suppose, fuzzy or less tangible or less clear. If it's a finding, and if you can do this within a small number of words, put it into the title. It really helps getting your message across as early as the desk scan by the editor-in-chief. In terms of writing up qualitative research, I think we also need to briefly talk about the ideas of ethics and integrity and reflexivity. This isn't a workshop on how to do qualitative research. This is a workshop where we talk about how this needs to be written up. And from personal experience, there is an increasing expectation from editors, from reviewers especially, that these things are addressed in detail. And this is one thing that is quite different from quantitative write-ups, isn't it? Where with, for example, survey questionnaires or so, we might not have the need to explain exactly what we did, how we did it, and why. Whereas in qualitative research, there is a lot more room for error. And one thing that I have seen a number of times in reviews recently is the idea of looking at procedural ethics versus situational ethics, where reviewers really want to see how the research fit within a certain cultural context, within a certain social context. And I think if we use our reflexivity sections in our qualitative papers with a view of explaining how we fit in with ethics and researcher integrity, that can go a long way in coming across as a self-reflected researcher who has put a lot of thought into the project rather than just having written it up. This is how we can explain all the things that we have probably all done, but making sure that others know them as well. So yes, we know that we need to reflect, but we also need to make sure that our readers know that we did this. And this is something that we really, really should not underestimate in reviews and obviously in the quality of the paper as well. So again, this is not a how-to workshop, so I've just added a few things that could be added in the reflexivity or self-description section. I'll pause here for a short moment to have a quick look at the chat to see if there's anything that we should look at.
Julia, yeah, I actually spotted a few questions. If it's easier for me to read it for you. And I think one question talk about, are there any opportunities for sliding our research and publish multiple manuscripts?
Yeah.
It's slicing.
That's an interesting one.
Slicing.
Yeah, slicing, yeah.
Our research is publishing multiple manuscripts. I guess that depends on the magnitude of the project, doesn't it? I think with a PhD project, for example, I can easily imagine that there would be, let's say, 3 or so papers in a PhD project. With projects that we do at later stages in our career, I guess it's a question of scale. I remember not long ago, it would have been last year, I heard Sarah Dolnitscher talking about not salami slicing our research and trying to spread it too thinly.
Although Mariana Sigala says it's a very good idea to do the slicing. So if you've got mixed method approach, of course, there's big opportunity, but I'm just thinking if you have all this qualitative data, it's still relevant, but now in COVID, we have new insights on the same phenomena. Do you combine it or do you do completely new research? Do you top it up? More relevant?
I think that's a really good question. From my own experience, looking at my own papers, I do tend to slice, I gotta say. And the reason why I do this is that qualitative papers end up very long papers usually, especially once they go through 1 or 2 rounds of reviews and you get at 400 words here, at 600 words there. You always end up with quite a long paper. And this is why personally I do tend to slice. About the COVID component of your question, I guess if you have pre-COVID information or data, and you are currently, or you have already collected information in a similar topic area, it does seem tempting to do, let's say, a comparative approach, if that's, if that fits with,
yes,
with what you have done. Because I've seen that at least one journal has stopped accepting pre-COVID data. And yes, that would be the only way of publishing this data in case more and more journals follow suit with us.
Okay.
Experience with your own work where the COVID question became a challenge? With your submission of your own work of pre-COVID data or so? Okay.
I'm just going to have one small question again in terms of COVID and pre-COVID. So being in the field and having the data and very rich data in terms of face-to-face and having many different data sets, and the same questions are now relevant in the COVID environment, as I'm in the events area, festivals and events area. So, attending face-to-face has different constructs which came out of the qualitative results initially. And the same respondents have very different and new insights. Do you report those together or is just completely new data set?
That's a difficult question. I guess it would be possible to write both papers. I guess it would be possible to report it separately, and it would be possible to report it as a comparative study. I don't think there's a yes or no answer to your question.
Okay.
It depends on what the question is that you want to answer in your paper. I would probably suggest that if the focus is on how things have changed, obviously you want both data sets. But if the focus is on something completely COVID unrelated, then maybe the pre-COVID data has been superseded.
Right.
It's difficult to say without knowing what exactly it is, but it sounds as though the more recent data might be more relevant, but it depends on how you frame it, of course.
Well, in the event situation where you cannot have it face-to-face anymore, but in a different way, the same respondent will have very different value perceptions.
I mean, going to the respondent checking thing that I raised earlier, maybe this is a situation where it would be worthwhile to go back to respondents to maybe obtain their views on whether they think their opinion has changed, and if so, why.
Yep. Okay. That really helps.
There was also vaguely related, no, not quite related, to be honest. I just saw Albert's question about the concept of data saturation and how it can be hard to claim saturation when new information would have emerged if we just kept collecting data. I agree. If we kept collecting data, obviously new things would come up eventually. I usually stop collecting data when I have a feeling that, oh, a participant who said this will probably say that later on, and I find that they actually do. And you get a feeling of what your respondents might say next based on what you have already analyzed. At that point, I sort of start getting the feeling that, oh, maybe another 4 or 5 interviews or focus groups or so might be sufficient. But yeah, it can be challenging. Anita mentioned that it is interesting that reflexivity statements are often omitted in the writing up of research papers. Yeah, they still often are, but I do think we see more and more reflexivity statements, and I think they can go a long way in adding credibility and context to qualitative research, because it's another way in which to provide checks and balances to that research, saying that, yes, you may think qualitative research is subjective, but I can explain to you where this interpretation comes from. So the idea of reflexivity, for example, becomes important in topics where, just as by way of an example, Westerners have worked in non-Western settings, for example. Papers like this that don't have a reflexivity section will probably not be published in good journals anymore. So I think people are increasingly becoming alert to this. What else? Salami slicing. The word count, yes, I agree. And did you notice that some journals even have different word counts now for qualitative and quantitative papers? So qualitative papers tend to get an additional 1,000 or 2,000 words, so yay. Qualitative. And Sabia says, in PhD research, the coding is done by one researcher, but the supervisors recheck them. In this case, how can we ensure reliability and validity of the codes? I guess I would say in this sense, trust your supervisors. I don't know who they are, but hopefully they will have done lots of qualitative research themselves and will be able to advise, because that's something that is impossible to say during a Zoom call without knowing the research. So keep those comments and questions coming. That's super helpful. Sorry, so Sabia, I do, but what about the examiner who may ask for reliability? A PhD thesis is slightly different in that sense, because obviously it needs to be your work. You can't have co-researchers as such in a PhD thesis. And this is where the reflexivity section can come in quite handy, because it would allow you to also talk about the research process and how you interacted with your supervisors and what role they have had in the research. Right. So I thank you very much. I'll put the chat aside for another minute or two, and then we can go back to comments and questions. One of the last points I wanted to raise was about narration and the storytelling component of writing up qualitative research. Now, much in the same way as with quantitative work, we follow those three main steps. We establish novelty, we provide context, and we provide evidence, and then we offer an explanation. Typical line of argument in an academic paper. However, because there are more choices to make, more ways in which the researcher can bring themselves into the research and qual work, we often need to add more detail into our description of, let's face it, pretty much everything that we did. So as an example, depending on what we did, we are unlikely to get away with the explanation that you see on the left side of the slides, where I say that I just made this up. Focus groups were analyzed to identify various themes related to visitor perceptions of the museum experience and related learning. This is the kind of stuff we probably have all seen as reviewers at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if we had all seen this in some shape or form. If we think about the beta journals that we want to publish in, this is not really something that we would get away with these days. So the explanation on the right side adds a lot more detail, and that's really the kind of thing that you see after review 1, that you see after review 2 of a paper. That's the kind of text that you might find in the published journal article. So for the intense degree of detail that journals now require, don't read all of it, but this is what actually needed doing for the Journal of Sustainable Tourism paper that I showed you earlier. So not only was the information that we used in vivo and how we used it required, we ended up demonstrating using quantitative and vivo measures that looked at the agreement among the separate researchers who did the data analysis. That's the kind of detail that not all, but a lot of journals require these days. So going back to the quote by Patton that I showed you earlier, what we're dealing with is, though, it's not witchcraft or anything, it's just explaining exactly what we did, how we did it, and what the implications are for the findings. And again, for qualitative research, more detail appears to be required. Here's another thing that we see increasingly with the good journals. For those of you who have been in the game a bit longer, 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been all about the empirical work and a lot of the time about theoretical or empirical or conceptual contributions, right? Recently, in the past 5 or so years, we always get these extra questions. What is the impact of your work? And this is, again, for quantitative and qualitative empirical work alike. However, the impact can be described differently and can be of a different nature for qualitative work. And again, this is why I included it here. And you can use this almost as a sort of checklist. Does my research do any of these things? If yes, I can probably list it as an impact. And sort of an added level of difficulty is this. You know how we often get reviewers who ask, how can your study be generalized? Well, with qualitative work, the generalization is really not the intent behind the research, is it? However, if we can explain how our exploration, description, and explanation of patterns can be useful, perhaps in a different field or a different context, then we have not generalizability, but perhaps transferability, which is also a pretty useful outcome of a research project, isn't it? So what else can we say about our work that makes it, again, relevant? We can talk about how it's timely. Lizette's COVID example comes to mind, obviously. We can identify impact by identifying specific groups of people who may find our research useful, and that can be other researchers, that can also be people in the industry or somebody else entirely. So identifying groups of people who might find our research relevant can be very helpful in this sense. We have, again, our options of theoretical, conceptual, empirical contribution. We can talk about taking our findings, whatever they are, and looking at our findings in a contemporary context, for example, with a view of examining them as contributors to sustainability, mitigators of climate change, or social responsibility, whatever it can be. Does our research speak with any contemporary issue? And if so, maybe it even has the potential for practical or policy implications. So impact can be a lot bigger than just thinking about, is it a practical recommendation that we can make, or is it a theoretical contribution? So all of these things are options in which qualitative research can make contributions. And obviously, if we can demonstrate that, this is really helpful. I want to close with a few main points, and then let's discuss, if we still have time, just a little bit. What I wanted to say is, it's a different writing style. It's a different way in which to frame or even sell a study. But once you get your head around it, it's actually not that hard. Qualitative research has a lot of strengths, a lot of advantages. Leverage those strengths. Don't apologize for being supposedly less objective than a quantitative study. Qualitative work is embedded in a really long history of really powerful research traditions. Explain what these are, what you did, and what it means for your finding. And qualitative research can be hugely powerful. Don't hide behind the data. Bring yourself into it. Have a reflexivity section in there as well. Have a lot of detail and make use of that list of possible contributions of your research. So, I took a bit longer than I thought I would, but I hope we still have time for a bit more discussion.
Thank you, Julia. So maybe we have time we almost run out of the session, but we maybe have one question from the audience.
I see one from Sabia about COVID and how your research respondents keep talking about COVID, which wasn't your research question, but you can't ignore it. Would it be wise to revise the research question or add something about COVID? It's an interesting one. I would probably go back to the patent quote. Explain to your reader what has happened and explain to your readers how COVID has overtaken, by the sounds of it, some of the other issues that you were initially wanting to address. I wonder how far the COVID theme is removed from what you were actually hoping when you're talking about events. So there's no yes or no answer. I wonder whether it's closely related or not. But I think the important thing is report on what you've done, report what happened. There was another question from Ankita. How do you think online data in qualitative research is welcomed by reviewer or seen more critically? Question back, what do you mean by online data? Do you mean Zoom interviews as opposed to in-person interviews? because Zoom interviews aren't a problem these days, as you can imagine.
Yeah, referring to social media.
Social media archives. Well, the question is social media archives actually qualitative data? What kind of analysis do you do? Do you do some sort of semantic analysis, or do you do more sort of word count type of things that in vivo might offer as well? I probably wouldn't argue that it's purely qualitative research, but it's publishable. Where there are studies out there who analyze online archives. Discourse analysis, here we go. So you treat your online responses. Well, you can analyze that as qualitative research. I would say yes, and it's probably publishable. It's probably quite interesting, actually. What else we got? In your opinion, what is the difference between a project designed for the qualitative paradigm and one designed only to gather qualitative data? I think what I talked about earlier in terms of coherence is the distinguishing factor here. If you design a project that is a qualitative project from beginning to end, you will have thought about what paradigm you are actually working in. You will have built your theoretical construct with the view of aligning your research questions and your theoretical construct and your data analysis all the way through to your interpretation of your findings. This would be a coherent project. And the other project that you've mentioned last is the one that just happened to gather qualitative data, which is probably still publishable, but it won't have the advantages of this coherent story that allows you to make all those claims to, for example, credibility, rigor, and so on. Hope that answers the question. Yeah.
So I think we are about to, have the time, and it's a very interesting discussion, a lot of information, Julia, and thank you so much for bringing such detailed perspective and professional opinion as well. So I think if we have more questions in future, Julia would be welcome email and questions as well. Yeah, and then it's very nice to have you here for your support for Jhdm Symposium, and our audience. Please continue to support the journal either as an author or reviewer. And we thank you all for your attendance to this event. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, and thank you for organizing, Emily.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Emily.
Credit goes to our volunteers. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye. I'm just reading the lovely comments.
Yeah.
Thanks, Julia. I think you did very well with your comments. You should download them in the chat, that's for sure. And can you share the PowerPoints? I found them very useful. I did take screenshots of many, but
yes,
is it possible?
Can you send me an email and then I can send you the PowerPoints?
For sure. I will definitely do that. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.